Elisa Carter never saw herself as the main character of anything. At 22, she lived a simple life alone in a small rented apartment, working as a waitress at a downtown cafe. She didn't own much, nor did she dream big, but there was something in her eyes, a kind of hidden light that made the world around her seem just a little more alive. Elisa was the type who remembered customers' names, who laughed alone at silly videos on her phone, and who wrote down dreams on old napkins when no one was watching. Still, deep down, she carried a constant feeling that something was missing, or maybe someone. This is one of those breathtaking stories, so grab your popcorn because it's about to begin. The city of San Diego was known for its golden beaches and sunsets that stole your breath away. But on that ordinary day, when the sky was veiled in a soft mist, and the air smelled like a new beginning, something quietly extraordinary was about to happen. Sometimes, the most unforgettable stories don't begin with grand explosions or dramatic twists. They begin with an absence, a silence, a subtle emptiness that creeps into a house, into a heart, until someone, unknowingly, decides to fill it. Across the city, in La Jolla, there was a grand house with heavy doors and windows too tall for the wind to enter. A beautiful house on the outside, but frozen on the inside. After the death of his wife, Henry Whitmore had become a man difficult to find. A successful businessman, widowed at 37, he had built invisible walls around himself, not just in his social life, but in his soul. His routine was exact, his gestures restrained, and his presence quiet. It was as if he existed without truly being there. His daughter, Sophie, just 6 years old, mirrored that same silence. Introspective, shy, and almost always tucked away in her own little world, Sophie rarely spoke to strangers and almost never smiled. It was chance or perhaps fate that placed Elisa in their path. On a random Tuesday, a friend called her last minute, desperate. "Can you cover my babysitting shift just for today? It's a house in La Jolla, good pay. You just need to watch a little girl for a few hours." Elisa hesitated. It wasn't the kind of thing she usually did, but something inside her, maybe curiosity, maybe that same lingering sense of absence, said yes. She had no idea that when she knocked on the door of that silent mansion, she wasn't just stepping into a new house. She was crossing the invisible threshold between the life she had and the one she was about to step into. And it wasn't the luxury that struck her first, not the expensive furniture or the endless hallways. It was the silence, a thick, heavy silence, as if the walls were used to keeping secrets. Sophie appeared slowly in the bedroom doorway, clutching a teddy bear and watching with cautious eyes. And Henry, always with a serious face and a quiet voice, simply said, "She doesn't talk much. It's best to leave her in her corner." But Elisa didn't know how to live in the corner. And maybe that's why she stayed. Maybe that's why Sophie looked at her with eyes that were just a little less sad. And maybe that's why Henry, even if he'd never admit it, felt a nearly imperceptible crack in the ice surrounding his chest. This isn't just a love story. It's a story about presence, about silences being broken, about a house learning how to breathe again. Because sometimes, the greatest transformation happens when someone walks in and simply chooses to stay. And that's how, without promises and without knowing it, Elisa Carter began to change everything. The rain had given way to a cloudy afternoon when Elisa returned to the mansion in La Jolla. The gate opened automatically, revealing a perfectly trimmed garden, yet lifeless. Everything seemed meticulously organized, as if disorder had been banned. As she rang the doorbell, a cold shiver ran down her spine, as if the walls themselves were watching her in silence. Henry opened the door with the same neutral expression as before. No smile, no excessive kindness, just a brief nod. Sophie appeared seconds later, behind her father, hugging the same teddy bear. Her big, dark eyes looked at Elisa with a mix of curiosity and caution. Elisa responded with a shy smile, but the girl simply turned her face away and slowly walked back inside. The moment Elisa crossed the threshold, she felt the weight of the atmosphere. It was as if the air inside was heavier. The mansion was beautifully decorated, filled with high-end furniture, minimalist paintings, soft lighting, everything impeccable. But there was no warmth, no smell of food, no laughter, Not even the light mess that usually comes with the child in the house. It was all too perfect, too clean, too quiet. Henry led Elisa to the main living room, briefly explaining Sophie's routine. She had lunch not long ago, usually plays alone in her room, or looks through books. She doesn't require much, and with that, he left, saying he'd be in his office next door, busy with meetings. Elisa was left alone with Sophie, who sat on the carpet and opened a picture book without saying a word. The hours passed slowly. Elisa tried to spark small conversations, but the girl responded only with gestures or silence. Still, there was something in the way Sophie glanced at her, as if slowly testing whether she could trust her. Elisa didn't push. She simply stayed, present, watching, waiting. She walked through the house, careful not to intrude, but what she saw in each room only reinforced her impression. That place had been frozen in time. A picture frame on the shelf still showed a smiling woman beside Henry and a much younger Sophie. The flowers in a crystal vase were dried out. There was an empty chair at the dining table, with the faint mark showing someone had sat there every day. The absence of Henry's wife was as palpable as Elisa's presence. It was as if the house was still in mourning even 2 years later, and Sophie, so little, seemed to carry that grief on her small shoulders. A child who had learned to stay silent before learning to open up. Later, when night fell, Henry appeared again. Sophie was already in her pajamas, ready for bed. She held Elisa's hand gently, as if still hesitant to fully trust, but already taking the first step. Henry watched for a few seconds. His gaze was unreadable, as if unsure of what he was feeling. "Elisa, thank you for today," he said quietly, almost as a formality. She just nodded with a gentle smile, but something inside her shifted. It wasn't pride or vanity, it was empathy. It was the certainty that all that silence wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. And as she left the house, walking through the dark, quiet hallway toward the door, Elisa felt something strange. As if that cold, restrained mansion had been waiting for something, or someone, and maybe, just maybe, she had been the one to finally spark the first flame. The third day began like the others. A partially cloudy sky, a soft ocean breeze, and the same quiet path to the La Jolla mansion. Elisa already knew the automatic gate, the sound of her footsteps on the marble floor, and the muffled creak of the door opening without excitement. But that day, something felt subtly different. Something she couldn't name, but could sense in the air, like a promise about to be fulfilled. Sophie waited at the top of the stairs, still holding her teddy bear, her feet swinging gently. When Elisa entered, the girl didn't run off to her room like before. She stayed, waiting, watching. And when Elisa raised her hand in a playful wave, Sophie did the same with a small smile that appeared and disappeared in less than a second. It was almost imperceptible, but for Elisa, it was as if the house had taken its first breath in a long time. That morning, they stayed in the living room. Elisa brought out some colored pencils and blank sheets of paper. She didn't push. She just started drawing in silence. Loose scribbles, little dots, messy flowers. Sophie watched from a distance, sitting on her heels, eyes fixed on the colors. And then, with a timidity that felt ceremonial, she approached, picked up a red pencil, and drew a circle. She said nothing, but looked at Elisa as if to ask, "Can I?" Elisa smiled and nodded with her eyes. And that's how they started drawing together, without words, but with lines that said everything that needed to be said. At lunch, Elisa suggested to the cook to prepare something Sophie might like. Maybe pancakes, with smiley faces made of fruit? The woman, used to the strict routine of the house, hesitated. But after a subtle look from Henry, who watched from a distance, the pancakes appeared on the table. When the plate arrived, Sophie's eyes lit up. And then, she laughed. Not a loud laugh, but a sweet, quiet one, as if she had forgotten what it felt like. Elisa laughed along, and for a moment, the sound filled the dining room. Henry, fork frozen in midair, looked at his daughter in surprise. His eyes met Elisa's, and he said nothing but didn't look away either. The days that followed brought small changes. Sophie began holding Elisa's hand when they went out to the garden. She started pointing at things with her fingers. A butterfly, a flower, a bird on the wall. And one afternoon, when Elisa sat on the living room carpet with the storybook, Sophie curled up beside her, resting her head on Elisa's leg. Elisa read slowly, with a gentle voice, and noticed the girl smiling in silence, playing with her fingers, more at ease than ever before. Henry watched it all from a distance, sometimes from the top of the stairs, other times from the office door left slightly ajar. A clear conflict played across his face. Part of him was moved to see his daughter blossom. Another part, perhaps, feared what it all meant. Elisa was kind, spontaneous, and warm, everything that house had forgotten how to be. And he knew it wasn't just Sophie who was changing. One late afternoon, as Elisa was about to leave, Sophie ran to her and hugged her legs. Without saying a word, just stood there, small and quiet, holding on. Henry witnessed it and took a deep breath. When Elisa stepped away, he walked her to the door. "Thank you for all of this," he said, not fully knowing what he was thanking her for. Elisa simply responded with a gentle smile, but in her heart, she knew the first smiles had begun, and with them, a quiet story was finding its voice inside a house that, until then, had only known the echo of emptiness. Time inside that house seemed to pass at a different pace, no longer dragging like before, but not rushing either. It was as if each day with Elisa opened small cracks through which the light began to slowly filter in. The mansion in La Jolla was no longer so silent. Sophie's footsteps echoed up and down the stairs. There were soft giggles coming from the living room, and sometimes even the sound of instrumental music playing in the background. But there was something more, something neither Elisa nor Henry could name, an invisible thread beginning to form between them, slowly weaving a bond that grew in the space between a glance and a pause held too long in a simple conversation. It all started with short talks in the late afternoon. Elisa, after finishing the day with Sophie, sometimes found Henry in the garden, watching the city lights come on in the distance. She'd approach quietly, without intruding, and he, to his own surprise, didn't move away. They spoke of trivial things at first: the weather, Sophie's school, a forgotten book on the shelf. But little by little, the words deepened. She shared stories of her simple childhood, of the napkins where she scribbled story ideas she never showed anyone. He spoke of the wife he had lost, of how sometimes he forgot the sound of her voice, and how that scared him. Elisa listened without interrupting. Henry spoke without realizing he was opening up. These moments were delicate, almost fragile. Nothing was said outright, but in their gestures, there was a quiet intimacy growing between them. Like when Henry offered her a mug of tea on a cold night, and their fingers brushed for just a second longer than necessary, or when she straightened the collar of his shirt without thinking, and he simply allowed it with a look that said everything, and at the same time, nothing. Sophie noticed. Children always do. She began drawing the three of them together, herself, Elisa, and her father, holding hands. One afternoon, she left one of those drawings on the closed piano in the living room. Elisa found it, folded it carefully, and tucked it into her purse. Henry saw it and said nothing. But that night, he stood for a long while at his daughter's bedroom door, watching her sleep with the teddy bear in her arms, as if trying to understand what was happening in his own life. One weekend, Henry invited Elisa to join him and Sophie on a trip to the park. It wasn't a formal invitation, nor did it carry any obvious intent. He simply said, "Sophie asked if you could come too." So she went. They walked through tree-lined paths, watched Sophie run, play, laugh loudly with other kids. Elisa sat on the grass, and when Sophie tripped and fell, Henry was the first to rush to her, but it was Elisa's arms the little girl chose to cry in. He stood there, watching, with an expression that seemed to admit what he didn't want to, that this bond was no longer temporary. On the way back, the silence in the car wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who share something that doesn't need to be spoken. When they arrived at the mansion, Henry got out first with Sophie. Elisa stayed in the car for a few seconds, breathing deeply. Her heart was racing, as if something was about to change. And it was. That night, as they said goodbye, Henry's eyes lingered on hers a little longer. There was no touch, no grand words, just a look full of unspoken things, full of a feeling not yet ready to be named. But it was there, an invisible thread, thin, delicate, between two souls who weren't searching for love, but recognized each other anyway, in the silence of a house that, finally, was beginning to wake up. It was raining in San Diego that day, one of those soft, persistent rains that doesn't frighten, but saddens. The sky was heavy, and the ocean breeze colder than usual. Elisa arrived at the mansion with her umbrella dripping, and her heart tight for no clear reason. The house felt different, quieter, more tense. Sophie didn't run to hug her like she had in recent weeks. She was on the couch, silent, staring out the window. Henry seemed off too, more serious than usual, more restrained. It all began with a misunderstanding. A phone call. A name Elisa mentioned by chance while telling Sophie a story. My old college friend, Liz, works as a journalist now. She's always trying to convince me to write about my experience here. Says it's almost like a fairy tale. Elisa laughed when she said it, but Henry's reaction was the complete opposite. At first, he simply looked at her with a slightly furrowed brow, but later that night, after Sophie had fallen asleep and Elisa was picking up toys from the living room floor, Henry called her into the office. His tone had changed. "Did you tell someone about us?" he asked, firm, direct. Elisa was confused. "No, I only mentioned to a trusted friend that I've been working here. I never said any names or shared any details." Henry pressed his lips together, visibly uncomfortable. "This house, my daughter, our privacy, it's all I have. I don't want it turned into some magazine article or social media story." Elisa's stomach dropped. "Do you really think I'd do that to you? That I'd use everything we've lived through as a story just to get attention?" He hesitated, but the tension in his eyes said enough. The pride, the unresolved pain, the guardedness of someone who had lost too much, it all poured out in what he didn't say. And then, trying to defend herself, Elisa said what she shouldn't have. "You hide so much, Henry, that even a little light scares you. I never wanted to expose anything. I was just happy to be here. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere. But it seems that even that's too dangerous for you." The silence that followed was like an abyss, heavy, full of hurt. Henry turned his back, unable to face her. Elisa, with tears in her eyes, realized she had crossed an invisible line. Not because she meant harm, but because she touched a wound he didn't yet know how to heal. The next morning, the message came by phone. "You don't need to come today, or in the coming days. Thank you for your time and dedication, Henry." Elisa read and reread those words, sitting on the bed in her tiny apartment. The rain still tapped against the window. She didn't cry right away. She just sat in silence. Only later, when she found Sophie's drawing of the three of them together in her purse, did the pain overflow. One thoughtless mistake, one misunderstood gesture, and everything they had built with such care, such quiet, such honesty seemed to collapse in seconds. Back at the mansion, Sophie went back to dragging her feet, to staying silent during meals, to avoiding her father's gaze. Henry tried to maintain the routine, but something was broken, and he knew it. Elisa, returned to her simple life, couldn't stop thinking about Sophie's eyes, about Henry's look that last night. It felt like she had lost something that wasn't hers, but had become a part of her. And at that moment, they both realized, it wasn't about a mistake. It was about fear. Fear of allowing oneself to love. Fear of being loved. And above all, fear of trusting that love could last. The days that followed were gray, even when the sun returned to shine over San Diego. Elisa walked the same streets, passed the same corners, served the same customers at the cafe, but everything felt different. As if life had lost a sound she hadn't even known she was hearing. It was like when the power goes out, and you only realize how much you miss the light once darkness takes over. She tried to move on, tried to smile, tried to convince herself it had only been a passing moment. But it hadn't, and the emptiness screamed silently inside her. In the small apartment where she lived, Elisa kept Sophie's drawing in the top drawer of her dresser. She looked at it every night before going to bed. Sometimes, she cried softly, not understanding how something so beautiful could fall apart so quickly. She didn't blame Henry. She didn't fully blame herself either. It was as if they had both stumbled over their own pain and, in trying to protect themselves, ended up pushing away what they needed most: each other. Back at the mansion in La Jolla, Everything seemed to return to how it was before. But there was a subtle difference, a kind of absence that now weighed. The sound of Sophie's laughter no longer echoed through the halls. The colored pencils were stored away in a box on a high shelf. The storybook lay closed on the rug. Sophie had gone back to silence, not as punishment, but as a kind of mourning. Mourning for something she couldn't name, but deeply felt. Henry noticed. Even if he didn't say it, he felt the weight of the house on his shoulders. The nights became long again. Breakfast was served as before, in silence. But now, there was a new discomfort, a quiet regret. Subtle. That showed itself in the details. In the way he looked at the empty door at the end of the day. In the way he would sometimes go up to Sophie's room and find her staring at the wall, holding her teddy bear, the light in her eyes gone. He tried to convince himself he had done the right thing, that protecting his daughter was his priority, that privacy was sacred. But deep down, he knew what he had lost wasn't just a babysitter or a pleasant companion. He had lost the sound of his daughter's laughter. He had lost the woman who made the house breathe again. And above all, he had lost the chance to leave the past where it belonged and make space for something new. Elisa, meanwhile, continued her days with a tired heart. She still worked at the cafe, still smiled at customers, still took orders. But at night, when she came home, the silence felt heavier than ever. And it wasn't the silence of solitude, it was the silence of everything left unsaid. She thought of Sophie, she thought of Henry, and how everything could have been different if fear hadn't spoken louder. So much remained inside her: care, kindness, gratitude, love, maybe. But none of those feelings had a place to grow again. Outside, the city went on. Waves crashed on the beach, tourists strolled along the sidewalks, cars crossed overpasses as if nothing had happened. But inside, two hearts, separated by pride and pain, there was a quiet waiting, as if both were unknowingly hoping for the same sign. A word, a gesture, anything that might say, "It's not over yet." And even without promises, without certainty, one subtle hope remained. Because sometimes, love needs silence to prove it's real. It needs absence to show how much it matters. And it needs time not to erase what was, but to strengthen what still could be. Without warnings, without fanfare, Elisa appeared at the mansion's door on a mild autumn afternoon, just as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. She didn't bring promises, no rehearsed speeches. She was simply there, hands slightly trembling, heart tight but firm in her decision not to give up on what had begun. Henry stood across the hall, unmoving, his expression hard, as if her presence stirred a storm of feelings he hadn't yet learned how to face. Sophie was in her room, but soon appeared quiet and discreet, as always, with her teddy bear in hand, and a look that seemed to carry the weight of many unspoken things. Elisa didn't rush. She let the silence between them be filled slowly, without pressure, without demands. She held out her hand to Sophie, who hesitated for a moment before grasping it with a timid grip, as if needing to make sure it was real. There were no words, only gestures: a delicate hug, a reserved smile, a glance that spoke louder than anything that could be said aloud. Henry remained silent, watching the scene unfold with eyes that seemed to search for meaning in what he felt. She hadn't come to plead. She hadn't come to beg for forgiveness. She had come back to show she was still there for Sophie, for everything they had lived, and for what was left unsaid. Her presence was the clearest and deepest message. In the weeks that followed, the mansion, once a place of absences and cold walls, began to change. Elisa became part of Sophie and Henry's routine, not as an outsider, but as someone who belonged there. And Sophie, once closed off from the world, began to open up again. She laughed more often, made eye contact, and felt safe enough to let her silence be replaced by words and gestures of affection. Henry, cautious as ever, also changed. Not in some fast or dramatic way, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to make room for what he once believed was lost forever. The walls he had built so carefully started to fall, brick by brick, replaced by a timid but sincere trust. On a rainy afternoon, as Elisa helped Sophie bake cookies in the kitchen, Henry stood watching from the half-open door, wearing a small, honest smile. The house finally felt like it could breathe again. It was no longer just a place where the past lived, it had become a home where the present and future were welcome. And there was no rush, no grand promises or detailed plans. Just the quiet certainty that the second chance was real, built with small steps, honest choices, and a silent forgiveness that didn't need to be spoken to exist. Because sometimes, the strongest kind of love is the one rebuilt through calm, patience, and the courage to stay even when fear urges you to run. And there, in that house in La Jolla, between glances, gentle touches, and shy smiles, a new story was beginning to be written. One that had room for mistakes, for scars, but also for hope and rediscovery. Sophie, the little girl who once lived only in silence, had become the bridge between two hearts, learning to finally listen to one another. As the months passed, the house in La Jolla turned into a true home, not just a physical space, but a place where stories intertwined, where the past didn't disappear, but no longer dictated everything. Henry, Elisa, and Sophie found their own rhythm, built from small routines, laughter, and even conflicts that now simply marked the growth of a family learning how to begin again. Henry was no longer the distant man, hardened by grief. He became a present father, a careful but honest companion. He didn't pour out his heart all at once or make grand declarations. Instead, he offered his steady presence, his simple gestures, his attentive eyes, a quiet invitation for Elisa to feel seen, welcomed, part of something that once seemed unreachable. Elisa, in turn, blossomed in the space that had once frightened her. The dreamer who used to work at a downtown cafe now found strength in Sophie's shy smile, in Henry's warm embrace, in the scent of fresh-baked cookies filling the kitchen on weekends. She learned to love not just the house itself, but what that new family represented, a safe space to stumble, to grow, to reinvent herself. Sophie, the introspective and sensitive girl, let the light in. She explored the garden with curiosity, chasing butterflies, proudly showing Elisa and Henry her tiny treasures, a colorful stone, a strange flower, a shell brought in by the tide. Her once rare smile now lit up the house, echoing joy through its halls. Their daily life was filled with simple things that meant everything. Henry made breakfast while Elisa set the table. Sophie helped mix cake batter, getting her hands dirty and laughing with joy. At night, the three gathered in the living room, watching movies or reading stories, creating memories that softened the shadows of the past. There were still challenges. Henry's insecurities would resurface at times. Elisa's doubts showed up in quiet hesitation. But unlike before, there was conversation. Trust slowly growing allowed fears to be shared and faced together. Mistakes were acknowledged. Forgiveness was offered. And love grew not like a fire that flares and fades, but like a steady light that warms and guides. The smell of cookies baking in the oven became a metaphor for this new beginning. Something sweet, simple, made with care, filling the home and inviting everyone to stay. The house that once held only silence and shadows now had music, conversation, and life. Every corner held a memory, every glance a quiet promise. Henry began holding Elisa's hand more often, a quiet gesture, but full of meaning. Sophie watched them, sensing that this love wasn't perfect, but it was real. A love built on choices, respect, and the courage to begin again. A love that knew how to cherish even the smallest moments, because in those, real happiness lives. And so, the family that once seemed broken began to rebuild, not by erasing the scars, but by learning how to live with them. The past wasn't gone. It was there, part of their story, but it no longer ruled the present or the future. They had found what so many search for without success. A home, not defined by walls or an address, but by love, care, and belonging. A place where the heart lives, and more importantly, where it feels loved. And in that rebuilt home, between sincere smiles, hands held, and silences filled with understanding, the promise lingered that life can always begin again if we're willing to make room for what truly matters. Months after that timid first meeting at the La Jolla mansion, The garden where everything began was glowing under the morning sun. Flowers were slowly waking to a new day. Henry held Elisa's hand, a simple gesture that carried the weight of everything they'd been through together. There were no rings on their fingers, no grand declarations, just a silence full of meaning, and the unspoken promise that this time, no one was leaving. They walked slowly across the lawn, breathing in the scent of roses and the fresh dew still clinging to the grass. Sophie ran ahead, chasing butterflies, her carefree laughter filling the air. Henry looked at his daughter, then at Elisa, and for the first time in a long while, he felt that this was exactly where he belonged. It wasn't a formal proposal, not a wedding request. It was something deeper and more true, a silent invitation for Elisa to stay, to build a life together not measured by ceremony or tradition, but by shared presence, mutual care, and a love grown with patience and courage. Elisa squeezed his hand, a soft smile on her face, knowing that this moment wasn't the end of a story, it was the beginning of a new chapter, full of possibility. They didn't need words anymore. They had lived enough to know, home isn't where you live, it's where you are loved. That house, once full of silence and absence, was now alive. The walls held laughter, the windows let in light and hope, and the hearts inside beat in harmony even through the imperfections life brings. Henry and Elisa had learned that true love isn't perfect, but it's real. It's not built overnight, but with patience, mistakes, forgiveness, and daily choices. Family isn't just blood, it's a bond of souls, formed through bravery and vulnerability. Sophie, the girl who had once closed herself off in silence, was now the thread connecting to hearts that had learned to see each other. She bloomed like a rare flower, delicate, strong, nourished by a love that didn't need words to exist. And there, in that garden, bathed in the soft light of late morning, they finally understood what it meant to truly be home. It wasn't the size of the mansion, or the elegance of the furniture, or the address on the mailbox. It was the feeling of belonging, the safety of an embrace that doesn't let go, the warmth of a gaze that welcomes, the quiet power of a presence that stays. It was there, in that simple yet deeply meaningful moment, that Henry and Elisa sealed a silent pact to walk side by side, face the challenges, celebrate the joys, and build a home where the heart could rest. No rush. No need for explanations or grandeur, just the commitment to be there, not to run, to love with all the strength and vulnerability that true love requires. And as Sophie ran through the garden, with the joy and innocence only a child can bring, Henry and Elisa walked hand in hand into the house, knowing they had finally found the place where their hearts belong. And so, we've come to the end of another story that speaks straight to the heart here at Enchanting Stories, a place where emotions come alive and every word is an invitation to feel, reflect, and dream. If you felt moved by this journey filled with silence, fresh starts, and love, you know what to do. Don't let this video pass by without giving it a big thumbs up. Your like truly makes a difference and helps us spread these powerful stories to even more hearts around the world. Oh, and of course, subscribe to the channel right now so you never miss a chapter of our enchanting tales. That little notification bell is your passport to emotions only we know how to deliver. Join this beautiful growing community full of people who, just like you, are searching for a little more magic, hope, and connection in their everyday lives. And hey, don't forget to drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to know who's on the other side, living this experience with us. Who knows, maybe your city will be featured in our next video. So let's keep turning the ordinary into the extraordinary, because here at Enchanting Stories, every story is a warm hug for the heart. See you next time, and may your day be filled with love and light.